15 to 20 minutes each, and then we'll take some questions and comments and some further debate. And I won't really make a very strong attempt to balance the debate, I don't think. I think that'll happen naturally looking around the room. And we will go from there. And our speakers will sum up for about 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes each at the end.
If you want.
Very good. Okay, and we should be out by about 9:30. So, I'll take Ruth to start.
Youth before tenure, and thanks for the cheer from the fan of local government unions in the back. Mark is very taken by capitalism, and he may well reasonably be in some ways. Capitalism has brought us progress, an explosion of technology and industry, unprecedented efficiency and productivity. It's connected people globally and built human cooperation on a scale unimaginable before. Markets have allowed producers to meet the needs of people of whom they had no direct knowledge. We have so much stuff people 100 years ago didn't have, and in some cases stuff they didn't even know they wanted. Capitalism has given us stuff. Now people can get very sniffy about stuff, forget about possessions, blah blah blah, but that sniffiness comes from a position of immense privilege of having stuff, of being a stuff haver. If I took a serf into my house and showed him my bed and my mobile phone and my fridge and my bike and my ridiculously large collection of food and clothes and comforts, they'd be very impressed. If I showed him my 90-something-year-old grandmother from rural Ireland who's still alive thanks to better diet and medical advances, they'd be impressed even more so. We're living through a period of peak in global life expectancy. On this, we can agree. Mark and I both have full grasp of the first half of the Communist Manifesto. But you're all smart people and you know there was more coming. Capitalism and its markets are also a system of exploitation and inequality. Every day, 22,000 children die because of poverty. Half of all deaths of under 5s in the world are attributable to hunger. That's a smaller proportion than in past epochs, but it's different in another way too. Not only can we produce enough food for them not to die, in many years we do produce enough food for them not to go hungry. Babies and toddlers die because the market doesn't allow for the food to get to them. 168 million children are engaged in child labour. Over half of those are in hazardous work. There are thousands of other facts like these about capitalism. Now, assuming you'll permit me to say these are bad things, what in the free market is it that breeds these inequalities? It's a particular exchange, one many of us partake in, the exchange between worker and employer. On the surface, it looks like any other exchange, a free exchange in the free market. I sell my ability to work, my skills, my time, my energy, and someone buys it, like selling or buying anything else in the market. A mobile phone, a book, a nuclear weapon. The difference being you don't simply have that moment of exchange and then move on with your life, with either your money or your mobile phone. In this exchange, your boss then controls a bulk of your life. It decides where your skills and energy go. It can decide where you live. It can destroy your health. In many ways, it's a central focus of our life, and it defines us on an individual level. Now, there's obviously one answer to this, which is don't be the worker, be the boss instead. This is where the fundamental inequality lies. One small class of people own the means of production, the means of production being the resources and facilities needed to make goods and services. One set of people own the resources to get rich off somebody else's work. And not content of getting rich off somebody else's work, the system compels them to squeeze more and more out of their workers, with little regard for the lives or happiness of the people producing their wealth. And to these people toiling together to make someone else rich, to them, capitalists say, you are the lucky ones. And in a way, that's true, because into this system is built a layer of unemployment, and unemployment means poverty. Depending where you are, that poverty takes different forms. In a wealthy country like ours, where through class struggle we've won a number of rights, benefits and safeguards, these safeguards stand against the logic of the free market. You might lose your home, you might face the choice between 3 meals a day or school shoes for your kids, you might not be able to turn on the heating in winter, but it can get worse. In a country like the US, where collective struggle and political representation has won less for us, it means you may lose your access to healthcare. If you're sick, you'll get sicker. If you're in pain, you'll suffer that agony. And to these people, the capitalists say, You too are the lucky ones. Because of course the brutality of capitalism does get worse. If you're unemployed in the UK or the US, you're unlikely to be one of the parents of those 22,000 children who our system leaves to die every day. Killed by diseases we have cures and preventions for, and hunger we have food for. If you have any faith in the potential of humanity, you must know we can do better than this. So rather than the free market, we propose socialism. We better define what we mean by socialism. In part, because someone in this room will probably try and convince you to be a socialist, and if you convince someone of something, you should probably know what it is. And in part because many people claim to be socialists and claim socialism for themselves. Many of those don't agree with each other, many of those don't agree with me, some of whom are our sworn enemies. You can't agree with Nye Bevins, Stalin, Trotsky, Mao, Pol Pot and Kautsky. So what's our socialism? Our socialism is class struggle against the capitalists, which removes them from power. Social ownership of the means of production. Cooperative and democratic management of the economy, and the end of oppression and exploitation. I mentioned once or twice we can produce enough food to end hunger. This is the key to what our socialism is. Socialism is possible because of the changes brought about by capitalism, by the expansion and socialisation of production. Ruling classes have been necessary throughout history because of scarcity. One class built a life and a civilization out of the work of others. Poverty came from the inability to provide the basics for the whole population. That scarcity no longer blights us, and we have the chance to build a new, more equal system through democratic planning. Democratic planning requires other things from us. It requires the habit of cooperation. It requires education, literacy and culture. It requires information and connectivity, and it requires the will to bring these things about. These are all provided by capitalism. Globalisation has linked people together. Planning exists across the economy in the public and the private sectors. Cooperation happens every day at work and to an even greater extent on the picket line or other arenas of struggle. What this democratic planning would mean for us is the ending of hunger, the ending of insecurity. It would mean work that would be shared out, ending unemployment and ending ridiculously long working hours. The shortening of the working week and the loss of that insecurity would mean we'd have more time to think, to be with the people we love, to read, to play. Human culture could flourish from that leisure. Rational distribution of resources will chip away at the source of violence and war. We have all the building blocks of that world, and we also have the source of the will to bring it about. We can do away with this wretched system. That source is within the class struggle, which inevitably flows from class relations. I know what you're thinking, this sounds great, who could argue we should just go for it? There are actually, amazingly, still some arguments against socialism and for capitalism, and I can't deal with all of them here or in the depth that they require, but let's cover some of them. The most damaging of them is that we've had socialism, and it led to state terror, removal of freedom and starvation. And we have to be very clear, Stalinism was not socialism. It was a system of extreme exploitation of workers and peasants. Stalinism is separated from socialism by a river of working class blood. We don't say this because it failed. This realisation didn't come to us in 1991. People like me have said this for decades, said that that was not socialism. The tradition I'm proud to be part of championed underground workers' movements in Stalinist states, and we cheered when people rose against them. Since the 1880s, Marxists argued against state socialism, bureaucratic control of the economy by the state. Socialism is democratic control by the working class. The 1917 revolution was socialist in the sense it was the beginning of an international revolution. If we go back to our prerequisites for socialism, it grows out of advanced capitalism. It wasn't possible in an isolated, backwards country like Russia. Stalinist economics developed in competition and imitation of the West. It was motivated by growth, not by reduction of the control of the economy over human life. It is much more part of your history than it is part of our future. Let's look at some other arguments against socialism. Locke, the father of liberalism, said, "Every man has property in his own person." I don't think anyone can disagree with that. My mind and my body are mine and mine alone, and they should belong to nobody else. From here, he contends logically we move to property rights, because property is simply the combination of my labour, my body, my mind, and the world's resources. And because I must be free to do with my person, and by extension my property I create, this extends to the property exchange. So I make these earrings and I'm free to place them on the market. But in fact, whichever small child or super exploited adult made my earrings never owned them. The person who owned them was the person who owned the factory. And he owned that factory because of the small class of people who own the means of production. It's a specific type of property we want to abolish. You can still have your own knickers, your own toothbrush, your own home, but what you can't have is the right to own another person or their means to make a living. Now, because the things we need are produced through collective social process, I won't whittle my own spoons, and I don't have the knowledge, or let alone the resources, to make a mobile phone. We have to collectively, socially own that means of production and what we produce. It is the structural inequality that we must destroy. But inequality drives innovation, enabling development and new technology, cries Mark. Quiet, Mark. Let's look at mobile phones. How was the Motorola technology development that allowed mobile phones to break through funded? It was funded through future sales to the rich? It was not. It was funded through a series of large contracts with the LAPD. In computing, where are all these big advances originating? Primarily, initially in academia, in massive state-funded projects in the military and space programs, and more recently in open source development. I'm sure there are major advances which fit the market drives innovation theory, but they are not the norm. Fridges and vaccines and internet all came out of the public sector. The private sector developed pizzas with hot dogs in the crust and those plastic things you scrape your tongue with, and I'm sure much more. But the major breakthroughs came through public sector investment. And why is that? It's because the public sector can plan, can take time, and can take risks. Major innovation requires failure after failure after failure in order to make breakthrough. That is not sustainable in a company. No, you can't compete on the market failing again and again and again, which is why these jumps forward come through public sector development. The biggest driver of technological development in the 20th century has been the US Army. Imagine if the public institution taking risks for progress had been basing that progress on human need and liberation rather than death and power, where we could be and what we could have right now. How am I doing for time?
10 minutes, 12 in.
Rush a bit. Okay, so next up, Mark talks about a robust political economy must be able to manage limited benevolence and rationality. So what he means by this is the market, by spreading decision-making, spreads the possible risk of human failure, because humans are not infallible. Now, this is a very good critique of a certain kind of model of a planned economy. If you have a small number of bureaucrats making decisions and they make a mistake, that could have a catastrophic effect on an economy in a way that even quite a large company failing could not. But we are not talking about a command economy, a small bureaucracy that is controlling the economy. We are talking about democratic planning by the working class, which would have many inputs on many different levels, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. That democracy would be a far better check on human folly than the market could be. We'd also be talking about creating a society where humans can flourish and make more rational, more benevolent actors in the economy. Finally, the critique that the global economy is far too complicated to plan. Markets are the only mechanism we have to deal with the huge number of disparate information inputs. Now, Mark has a video, which if you're a student you might have seen, which explains this. So he's walking around in central London looking very suave, and he's going to a coffee shop, and there's a close-up on a cup of coffee, and then it pans out to his face. And he faces you. And he tells you about the market. So there's been a rise in the price of coffee because something's happened to coffee production in one of the countries that's producing coffee. We're going to say it's Mexico. That's probably caused by climate change, which we'll get back to later. So the price of, there's less coffee around, and so the price of coffee has gone up. So I need 3 people who like coffee. Put your hand up if you like coffee. You like coffee? You like coffee? Anyone else like coffee? You like coffee. Okay, who also likes tea? None of you like tea. Right, you like tea and coffee. So you like tea and coffee, so when the price of coffee goes up, you're going to drink tea instead. You really like coffee, and you like the coffee you're drinking, so you're going to stick with your fancy brand of coffee. No, you're going to get a cheaper brand of coffee. You're going to cut. She's not even going to drink coffee. And what are you going to do? You're going to pay for the coffee?
No, I'll probably just make my coffee at home.
She's going to make her coffee at home. Does anyone really love coffee enough to stick with their brand? You do. You're going to stick with your brand of coffee. Okay, so that's worked out quite nicely. The market's done pretty well. There's no reason why we couldn't have a similar mechanism initially under socialism. These kind of markets will continue for some time, very likely. We actually have incredible information advances that mean that the idea that only the market could deal with that amount of information in the global economy is patently nonsense to the generation of people who are being educated now. Information and planning, the information and planning required to run a company like Amazon is enormous. There's a huge amount of planning and information going in. We've got just-in-time production, you've got capacity for huge calculations within computing, but this kind of market forces is perfectly valid. And anyway, so we're going to have this market in coffee, so you're all going to tea, no coffee, coffee at home, same coffee. Okay, so now we're going to expand out Mark's plan, because he didn't show this bit. I need 5 people who need to work for a living. You need to work for a living, you need to work, okay, so you at the back, you're going to be a coffee grower. The coffee plant has failed because of climate change. You grow and pick coffee. The coffee plant has failed because of climate change, and so the message you're getting back from the market is you now live in absolute poverty because you don't have any other skills. Your family have lost their home, and you're very hungry. You need to work for a living. You dry coffee, but you've moved into a different industry because you've got transferable skills. So you're going to the most dynamic private sector industry in Mexico. So you now work for a drug cartel.
I knew it was my calling.
Sadly, you die quite soon afterwards. So I'm sorry to hear that.
Legalized drugs.
Who else? You're going to work for a living. You are a transport worker, and you have less hours. So you're kind of getting by, but you can't afford all the things you used to have, and so you've turned the heating off at home, and someone's going to sell coffee. You're not affected. You work in a coffee shop, and the coffee's still coming. She's still buying your coffee, so you're fine. Okay, and that decision is made because we need 2 people who are willing to be bosses. Should we be bosses?
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason that all these things have happened and the price of coffee has gone up is because there's not enough coffee. So I produce the coffee and you sell it. There's less coffee, so I'm just going to charge you more for my produced coffee because I don't want to drop my profit. I'm going to cut that guy's wages. What are you going to do with your sale of coffee?
What am I going to do? I'm going to charge more for it.
Charge more for the coffee. Okay, so the phenomenal rationality of the market has meant that we are both still very rich because we've stuck with our profit. You drink tea, you don't drink coffee, you still drink coffee, you drink coffee at home, you just died of starvation, you got shot in the street, you lost your house, and you still work for crap money in Starbucks. Sorry. So that's the rationality and the freedom that we have in the market right there. You're living your life and you lose your job and you lose your home, or you possibly lose your entire life. Not because you stopped working hard, not because you nicked something at work, not because you punched your boss, although some of you I'm sure were tempted, not even because people don't want the things you produce. When the US housing market crashed, there wasn't even a natural disaster to explain it. They didn't all exercise their freedom and say, I think I'll try camping now. They lost their homes due to a far-reaching crisis that resulted from a disruption in the exchange. Lives are ripped apart this way. A woman with no money can't afford a meal whether or not she is starving. But me and my coffee oligarch friend, if we want to commission a chocolate statue of Mark and share it after our large dinner of quails and that, we can afford to, because whether you starve falls below the right of the rich to get richer. It's an inhuman system in which human need without money means nothing. We now have everything we need to leave it behind, and we should do.
Thank you. Okay, and now Mark.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I can tell you now that this is a much more fun way of spending Friday evening than what I normally do with my time.
Intriguing.
So I'm going to make the case that workers' liberty requires capitalist institutions. So let me start off by defining what I mean by capitalism. Capitalism is a social system where there is substantial, though not exclusively, private ownership of the means of production. It's a regime where individuals, either individually or in groupings, through cooperatives, through firms, through corporations, own the means of production. It doesn't exclude necessarily some forms of state ownership, and neither does it exclude the redistribution of income. So capitalist systems can include income redistribution. They can have also elements of state intervention or regulation. What distinguishes them from socialist regimes is that there is a preponderance of private ownership of the means of production. I understand socialism to be any regime where there is little or no private ownership of means of production and where the allocation of capital and goods occurs through some form of collective action. Now, in the first part of my remarks, I'm going to set out what we might call the conventional case for capitalism, the case for capitalism as we know it. We can call this the pragmatic case for capitalism, and we've heard actually some of the arguments already alluded to in the first presentation. In the second part of my remarks, though, I'm going to make the case for capitalism as it could be. I'll argue that even if the pragmatic objections to socialism could be overcome, capitalist institutions are preferable because they hold people to a higher ethical ideal. The specific institutions that would best represent that ideal are those of what I would describe as an anarcho-capitalist society. So to begin, let me set out the pragmatic case for capitalism as we know it. The pragmatic case for capitalism and against socialism has got two elements. The first of these is an argument about the informational capacities of capitalism. There are a number of different elements to this argument which I'm going to sketch out. The first is the suggestion that it is not possible to have an advanced economic system without substantial reliance on market prices. Not exclusive reliance on market prices, but substantial reliance on market prices. Prices convey dispersed information about the changing scarcities, the shifting supplies and demands of countless different inputs and outputs, which cannot be centralized or communicated to any one place. Profit and loss accounting within a context of market prices enables producers to learn which goods generate the maximum value from the minimum of inputs. Any economic system which is remotely rational needs to be able to calculate where the maximum value is from the minimum of inputs. You don't want to maximize your inputs, you want to minimize your inputs for the maximum return. Without market prices, you cannot have economic calculation, you cannot have a rational allocation of economic resources. We see the consequence of that in all sorts of socialist regimes that have moved away from the system of market prices. They have always been characterized by a systematic production of things that people don't want and with inputs that are too expensive relative to the demands of the people who are actually concerned about the goods that are produced. So that's the first argument. The second argument is that prices, if they're to be effective communicators of information, cannot be determined effectively if there is a single public owner of the means of production. They need to arise from a bottom-up process where decision makers are at liberty to bid up or down prices in response to circumstances of which only they are familiar. And that capacity to bid up or down prices requires substantially private ownership of both capital and consumption goods. In a market economy with private ownership, each person is a data point. Every time someone decides to buy one good over another or make one investment decision over another. They transmit a piece of information about their circumstances to other actors, which those actors can then adapt to. The level of complexity that can be generated by such a system and adapted to by such a system is far superior to what would be the case if a single board of people tried to guess what all of the other circumstances facing everybody else actually are. Now, sometimes it's suggested, and we've heard it suggested this evening, that this problem can be overcome by developments in technology. For example, artificial intelligence. This argument has a fatal flaw. If artificial intelligence increases the capacity of people to process information, that's simply an argument for giving that technology to individual people. The complexity of the system that will be generated by the interaction of all these different technologies will be more complex than can be comprehended by any single center of control. That is a basic fact of the human condition that no amount of technology can remove. No amount of technological change can change that basic fact. The third element of the informational argument, again, has already been alluded to. It's the idea that multiple ownership of property, not necessarily equal ownership, disperses risk. If you have a single center of control, a single owner, and that ownership regime makes mistakes, the whole system is affected in a negative way. If ownership is dispersed, there will inevitably be mistakes because people are limited, they're fallible, but those mistakes will not be systemic in nature. The effects of any error can be minimized precisely because in a regime of private ownership, not of social ownership, there are multiple decision-making nodes. The final aspect of this argument is the notion that a private property regime allows for what I would describe as permissionless innovation. People can try out new ideas, whether in production or consumption, without requiring the permission of large numbers of other actors. Progress in all fields of human endeavor, whether it's arts, science, or economics, occurs when some people, a minority of people, call them entrepreneurs, break from what the majority believes is the right way to behave, and they do something different. Then gradually their ideas are imitated, they're picked up by others, and we have progress spreading through a ripple effect. Progress never occurs by the majority deciding what counts as innovation. By definition, in many cases, innovation is what the majority cannot see. It's what minorities spot and move ahead with without requiring the permission of large numbers of other actors. Only a regime based on private property can allow for minorities to experiment without requiring the permission of large numbers of other actors. That's the informational argument. But we have a second argument, which is what we can call an incentives argument for capitalism. On this view, private property provides people with better incentives. If they put their property to uses that others value, they can profit personally from doing so. And if they make mistakes, they can lose that property. If you work hard or you make the right investments, you can gain. If you decide not to work hard or you make the wrong investments, you can lose. Common ownership does not provide people with equivalent skin in the game. The outcomes people experience under a regime of social ownership are not determined by their choices to work hard or to make one investment over another. They are determined by the actions of a collective body over which they can have little effective control. In the case of an authoritarian form of socialism, the decisions are made effectively by some kind of central planning committee, which determines the fortunes of everybody else. In the case of a democratic form of common property, having a 100,000th, 1 millionth, or 1 billionth share in the right to attend periodic committee meetings without any right to sell that share offers no meaningful control. In practice, democratic common ownership means control by whichever coalition of interest groups manages to capture the state apparatus. And without the capacity of people to sell their shares in what they socially own, those who do get to control the governing apparatus can concentrate gains on themselves while dispersing losses across the rest of the population. Now, under real-world capitalism, we have examples, too many examples, of the privatization of gains and the socialization of losses. Think about the financial crisis, the bailing out of the banks, and think about also routine policies like agricultural subsidies. Those are real problems in genuinely existing capitalist systems. But they are bugs in the system, in my view, not inherent features of the system. By contrast, under social ownership of the means of production, the privatization of gain and the socialization of loss is a permanent feature of the regime. This is precisely what we've seen in any state that has called itself socialist, and it's what we're witnessing today in Venezuela. The second aspect of this incentives argument is as follows. Private property decentralizes power and limits its abuse. Though there are concentrations of power under capitalism, these are not as pronounced as they are under a regime of universal common or social ownership. Think about multinational corporations. If you look at the latest figures, the top 100 multinational companies in the world account for approximately 6% of global GDP. Those companies only have the power that they have, and they do have power, because they sell things that people want. They require the consent of the people who buy their products. Now, sometimes they use that power in inappropriate means. They use their economic power to go to the state, to steal from other people. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But in general, those corporations have to compete for people's money. Under a regime of social ownership, there is no competition. There is only one body that you can account to. If you cannot exit the regime, you cannot hold the regime to account. In practice, universal social ownership, without the right of exit that private property brings, does not mean power to the people. It means power to whichever group gets to control the state apparatus. And whoever is ruthless enough to use that monopoly of force in ways that they approve of. That is precisely what is happening today in Venezuela, and it's precisely what has happened under every regime that has called itself socialist. They always start by saying they favor democracy, but they always end up with something that no one would recognize as being democratic control. Now, the arguments that I've sketched out, I believe now, up to now, account for the success of capitalism and the failure of socialism. They explain why capitalist societies are more prosperous. They explain why living standards for the working class have increased by 1,800% since the Industrial Revolution. They explain why in the last 20 years we've seen the biggest ever reduction in global poverty as China has moved towards a capitalist model. And they explain why in socialist regimes people have to be kept in. There are very few people in today's world who are running to move to socialist regimes. People are trying to move to capitalist regimes. Now, I think these are persuasive arguments. I guess I would. But I think they're opening to an important objection. And it's one that's already been alluded to. Can't we expect more from people than the kind of arguments that I've just put forward? Okay. Can't we expect more of people? Isn't socialism to be preferred because it expects more from people than capitalism does? On this view, if we strive for improvements in human character, rather than assuming that the human condition is fixed, socialist institutions would be workable as well as being ethically superior. This argument goes something like this. So, up to now, why has socialism failed? It's failed essentially because people are too selfish. Okay? If people were not selfish, if they were socialized to actually think about the common good rather than private greed, then collective ownership could work. People wouldn't need private property rights to incentivize them to act in the right way. And they'd give freely to those less fortunate than themselves. They wouldn't have to be coerced to support the least advantaged, in the way they have been under real-world socialism, and in the way in which they are in real-world capitalism, through institutions such as the welfare state. People would give freely to the disadvantaged, because that is the morally right thing to do. To continue the argument, socialism has failed because its leaders have abused power. But if people were socialized into a proper respect for their fellows, those in positions of authority would only ever do what is in the common good. They wouldn't dream of privatising gains and socialising losses. There's no need for the collective ownership of property to end in famines or to lead to gulags. Now, the problem with this kind of argument is that it can be applied to the case for capitalism. Real-world capitalism already outperforms really existing socialism, but it could work far better if people could be socialised out of some of the behaviours they exhibit in today's world. What are those behaviours? Capitalism today falls short of its potential because people do not treat each other as ends in themselves. They treat people as instruments to be used and exploited. There's nothing inherently exploitable about trade. It represents fundamentally the principle of reciprocity. But in today's world, people often take advantage of informational imbalances or the misfortunes of other people to rip off their trading partners. If they were socialised out of such selfish traits and learned to respect others as ends in themselves, we could have the benefits of trade and the division of labour without the downsides. Capitalism falls short of its potential because those who lack sufficient opportunity to live a good life through no fault of their own are often neglected. Insofar as their interests are catered for at all, people have to be coerced into doing the right thing through the welfare state. But if people were properly socialised into respecting the moral worth of others, not only would capitalism provide more and better opportunities to the disadvantaged, people wouldn't need to be coerced into doing the right thing. We could dispense with the entire bureaucratic apparatus of the welfare state and rely on voluntary giving. Not patronising charity, but voluntary giving motivated by a genuine desire to improve the lives of others. Capitalism has fallen short of its potential because people do not always respect the personal property domain of others. They often steal and dump pollution into other people's property. As a consequence, while supporters of capitalism claim that it reduces coercion, to keep the system operating, it requires a massive apparatus of coercion to enforce property rights. But if people were properly socialised into the importance of respecting the rights of others, we could dispense with this entire apparatus of state coercion. We could have a world where people do not need to be coerced into respecting each other's property and abolish the criminal justice system. We could aspire to an anarcho-capitalist society where the state withers away as it is supposed to do, but never does under free access communism. Now, many socialists will argue that this is fantasy. It's fantasy to expect people living under capitalism to transform themselves in the way I've just described, because it's the very existence of capitalism that makes people behave badly. But this argument should be rejected. If we're supposed to accept that people can be socialised so that it's not inevitable for socialism to end in famine, dictatorship and gulags, then we should also accept that it's also possible to socialise people in a way that mitigates the morally reprehensible aspects of the capitalism we see today. It seems to me that both socialism and capitalism would perform better if people were more morally virtuous. In my view, though, capitalism would still be the morally superior option. Why is that? The reason is simple and straightforward. The institution of private property respects human differences in a way that a regime based on collective or social ownership, even a well-functioning one, simply cannot do. People value things differently. Some people value material goods, while others value leisure time. Some people are not concerned about economic progress, but value instead environmental conservation. Some people work to live, while others live to work. Some people like taking risks, while others are more conservative. Some people prefer to work on their own initiative, while others prefer to work collaboratively, and still others, who don't like spending most of the day in workers' committee meetings, prefer to work for a boss. Only a regime with substantially private property can reflect those differences in value, and critically, the personhood of individual people that these differences represent. Because private property respects the right of people to make different decisions. Private property does not prohibit collective or common ownership. If workers want to live and work in a commune or kibbutz, they can pool their property to do so. But if they want to create their own business and to act as an independent entrepreneur or to work for such an entrepreneur, respect for private property guarantees the freedom of workers to do so. Socialism forbids individual entrepreneurship because it does not allow private ownership of means of production. It does not give individual workers the capacity to choose the kind of arrangements under which they work, and it does not allow people individually to make trade-offs between competing values. At best, collective ownership ensures that the values of the majority determine what everybody else gets to choose. Now, the response to this argument that you may hear from socialists, in my view, only serves to demonstrate the ethical superiority of a system of private ownership. It will be suggested that if we allow people to make different choices, to work under different arrangements, and to trade off values in different ways, that this will generate inequalities, and that these inequalities will alienate people from one another. To avoid the baleful effects of alienation, we need to take decisions so that everybody experiences the same outcome. But why should allowing people to make different decisions lead to alienation? If we are to believe that allowing differences in income and wealth results in a situation where those who are rich can't respect the humanity of those who are relatively poor, then presumably this would imply the need to eradicate all other human differences as well. It would imply, for example, that people who are physically attractive and get a lot of sex can't understand the humanity of the ugly who get very little. It would imply that straight people can't empathise with gay people. It would imply that people with religious beliefs can't empathise with people of a different faith or those of none. Let us be clear. To suggest that people will be incapable of respecting the humanity of others unless differences are eradicated is not to appeal to the highest in human nature. Asking people to respect differences, including differences in wealth that result from different value judgments and choices, and still to expect them to treat others with humanity, is to hold people to a higher ethical standard. And that standard lies at the core of capitalist ethics. I don't know whether the ideal capitalist world I've just set out is possible. I do believe that the ideal is a valuable aspiration. Real-world socialism is a failure, but it is also ethically inferior to the capitalist ideal. Thank you very much.